session on the Biden administration's impact on energy infrastructure. So with that, Emily, take it away.
Thank you, Josh. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the participants and for our panel speakers. I'm happy to moderate the MEI's first session of this event. This morning, we are joined by 3 speakers to discuss the Biden administration's infrastructure policy proposals, including resiliency, financing, and regulation. The full bios of our panel speakers are in the packet that Josh provided, but I will briefly introduce all 3 before our first speaker begins. Dr. Karen Wayland is the CEO of Gridwise Alliance and a recognized expert in national energy and environmental policy. She served in leadership positions at the highest levels of government and nonprofit organizations. Then we have Jeffrey Shub, who is the executive director of the Coalition for Green Capital, an expert on green bank finance institutions that use public finance to accelerate private investment in an equitable clean energy transition. And finally, Ian Adams is the managing director of Clean Energy Trust, where he leads efforts to identify new innovations, evaluations, new investment opportunities, and develops new initiatives to support early stage innovation. If you have any questions during it, you can put it in the chat or in the Q&A, and I will try to get them in order, either once our speakers are finished or during it if that's how they want to answer. So please, Dr. Wayland, begin when you are ready, and thank you very much for all the participants today.
Thank you, Emily, and thanks to Josh and MEI for hosting this panel, inviting us. I know how difficult it is to switch from live events to virtual conferences, having done that for our Grid Connects in December, and I'm hoping that in our next December meeting, we'll be able to do some sort of hybrid, that we're going to be able to harness the technology that we've all sort of gotten used to in a way to really build out good discussions. So thank you again. Just to give some framing, we decided to divide up this discussion. So I'm going to deal with transportation and distribution infrastructure, and Ian is going to talk about more the generation side and the clean energy standard, and then Jeff is going to talk more about clean energy financing. So next slide, please, Travis. Just a little bit about Gridwise to start off. We are a membership organization that works to support grid modernization at the federal and state level. We work on policy and regulatory principles, best practices. We work on convening stakeholders and interact with industry leaders and the Department of Energy and state energy offices, state public utility commissions to support efforts for grid modernization. Next slide. And a little bit about our members. We have about half our members are utilities, IOUs, rural co-ops, and municipal utilities. Then we also have vendors and equipment manufacturers of grid equipment, as well as national labs and research institutions as well. Next slide, please. And among the things we do, you may be interested in our Grid Modernization Index, in which we rank states based on their efforts on grid modernization, based on their state policies, the utility investments in modern grid technology, and their customer engagement. And we also put out occasional reports on the grid. So next slide, please. So we were looking very closely at the American Jobs Plan released by the Biden administration last month, and there is a lot of good in there to like. So I'm just focusing in on the things that are related to the grid, either the grid itself or the things that might get plugged into the grid and not generation. As I mentioned, Ian will be talking about that. So let's just start with transportation electrification. This is one of the largest investments in this $2 trillion package. There's a proposed $174 billion for transportation electrification. That includes tax incentives and other incentives for consumer electric vehicle purchases, funding for state and local governments to establish a network of 500,000 charging stations around the country, a goal to electrify 20% of the nation's school buses, and also a pledge to use of federal power of procurement to electrify the federal fleet. And just recently, the Biden administration rolled out an announcement on electric vehicles following up on this, which laid out a very accelerated increase in the electric vehicles within the federal fleet. So stay tuned for that, because that is going to happen really quickly. There's another section in this $2 trillion package devoted to resilience. And they talk about critical infrastructure, including the electric grid, as well as defending vulnerable communities. And that is a $50 billion commitment. I will say that, you know, the information that we have on the Biden administration's jobs plan comes from a 25-page fact sheet. We haven't seen we haven't seen kind of the detailed breakdown, for example, of how this $50 billion would be spent. And so, you know, we will be continuing to work with the administration and Congress to get more details on this over the coming weeks. So the next very large chunk of money that relates to energy infrastructure is rebuilding infrastructure. It's a larger subsection than that, and includes water infrastructure and broadband. There's a $100 billion commitment for broadband with a goal of 100% coverage around the country. And then there's $100 billion for what they are calling a resilient transmission system. They've established a goal of 20 gigawatts of new high voltage power lines, and included a series of provisions that might help to accelerate that, including a new authority within the Department of Energy to work on building those transmission lines along existing rights of way. There's a 10-year extension and phase down of the ITC and PTC for renewable energy. They recommend including storage in those tax incentives, and also are recommending a direct pay for those entities that don't have any tax appetite at the moment. They're also, again, following on using the whole of government approach to accelerating climate change, are recommending that are pledging that they will buy clean power for federal buildings, basically 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, which is the kind of pledge that we're seeing from Amazon and Google and Microsoft and the other big companies, trying to figure out how to make sure that the energy that they're buying is clean, you know, all day long, all week long. And finally, Ian will talk more about this section, which has an energy efficiency and clean energy standard. So next slide, please. When we looked at the infrastructure package, we saw, you know, very ambitious climate goals, very ambitious infrastructure goals, that if we get that $2 trillion and there's a spend out rate of, say, 3 to 5 years, that will result in significant deployment of clean energy resources and a big push in terms of turning over the vehicle fleet and the building infrastructure to make them, you know, more energy efficient and much more relying on electricity. And we have to ask ourselves the question of whether the grid itself is ready for this. What we heard from the administration, what we see in the infrastructure package, is a big focus on building new transmission. But we as Gridwise are very much focused on the existing grid and how to deploy grid enhancing technologies that actually enable the things that we want to see. So we're really grappling with the concept of what does it mean for the grid to be ready to be the platform for all of these things that we want it to do. We want electrified transportation. We want electrified buildings. We want you know, a massive scale up of distributed energy resources, as well as utility scale renewables. We want microgrids for resiliency and the new transmission. And so we're really thinking about, we don't see a big investment in the grid itself in this package. So we will be continuing to work with Congress and the administration to make sure that we are focused in on the kinds of what the grid needs to look like in order to accommodate even just a 5% increase in electric vehicles or a 10% increase in distributed energy resources. So next slide, please. So we have put together, as a result, you know, starting from last year, actually, I was in Speaker Pelosi's office in the years after the 2008 economic downturn and the 2009 Recovery Act. And so I watched what was happening in 2020 with the economy and Congress doing kind of rescue bills for the economy. And I thought that soon we would have to tackle, you know, a true recovery bill where we're investing in infrastructure to create jobs and bring the economy back. So we started thinking about what it would look like to have an infrastructure package. And we put together a proposal that has a few guiding principles, that if we're going to get money out into the economy fast and really scale up deployment of technology, we need to use existing programs and not create new things. We need to make sure that we are result that kind of funding does result in large scale deployment of technologies. That the grid is so much more important now than it was 10, 12 years ago, that the scale of investment in the grid itself needs to be larger than it was in the Recovery Act. And in the Recovery Act, it was about $10 billion. We think that state energy offices are a very effective way to move federal funds out into the economy quickly and deliver locally appropriate solutions. So, for example, I think that the state energy offices will be a great place to put money for investments in resilience in particular. And given the different business models of utilities, whether you're talking about an IOU or a publicly owned municipal utility or a co-op, because of those different business models, we may need different funding mechanisms to achieve similar outcomes. And then I will say that what I'm going to talk about for the next couple slides is an agenda just on the grid and not on storage, not on electric vehicles. You've seen that those are in the Biden plan already and are well articulated by other coalitions. And we are focused in just on the kind of grid investments that need to be made, because we're not actually hearing a lot of discussion around that, around infrastructure package. And then finally, when we talk about $100 billion for broadband, what we want to make sure is that that it isn't just the telecom industry that we look at as providing solutions to the problem of linking everybody in this country up to broadband, that utilities actually have relationships with all their customers and an obligation to serve. And this is particularly true in rural areas where telecom companies may not necessarily want to go, but that your co-ops actually do have a relationship with every single customer and can provide broadband. So we should think broadly about who can be part of this solution for broadband. Next slide, please. So our recommendation is that Congress should appropriate at least $50 billion for grid modernization in an infrastructure package. And we think it's really critical that we are not going to be able to meet our climate goals if we don't also do big investments in our grid. So the first bucket we're looking at is deployment of technologies to enhance grid flexibility. These are things like storage, data, sensors, data analytics, software as service, the things that allow grid operators to have greater visibility into what's being plugged into the grid, greater visibility about intermittent variable renewables, more autonomous controls to prevent disruptions of power. And we have an existing program that is able to move money quickly out into projects like this, and that's the DOE Smart Grid Investment Grant Program. We also, in recognizing that we need different funding mechanisms for different entities, recommend that we increase the borrowing authority for the power marketing administrations, the BPA, the WAPA, for their, to help accelerate their grid modernization efforts. The second bucket is the deployment of technologies to enhance grid integration of buildings and vehicles. Right now, a lot of the conversation around electrifying buildings and electrifying vehicles is about how they're going to, what are we going to do about retrofits for buildings, and how are we going to, build charging stations to address range anxiety. But what we really need to be thinking about is what the grid needs to look like in order to accommodate, this 20 million electric vehicles by 2035. And we're going to need a lot of investment on the grid to make that happen. And if we're going to make that happen, we also want to think about how we might make buildings and vehicles assets to the grid so that they can provide grid services like ancillary services like power back to the grid, when EVs are plugged in. So there's a lot of investment that will need to be made on the grid in order to make that a reality. And then as we move to an increasingly interconnected and digital grid, we're going to need to really address the cybersecurity threat, which is real and growing. And there are three legs to that stool. One is technology deployment, the technologies that actually are in place to stop cyber attacks. The second is monitoring platforms. DOE already has an existing program that funds small and medium utilities the ability to participate in monitoring platforms that do cyber assessments and information sharing. And that we, with not much compared to $2 trillion, we could get almost every utility engaged in some of these monitoring platforms. And then finally, it is significant that workforce is here. The lack of trained cybersecurity workforce in the utility sector is a huge threat to our sector. So we do include workforce development as our last bucket of funding in number 7 on the next slide, please. But we do want to call out the specific need for cybersecurity workforce. Next, please. And I'll note that there is no mention of cyber anywhere in the infrastructure package, but we do know that the Biden administration is paying close attention and has a whole separate initiative on cybersecurity for industrial control systems, which would include the power sector. So we're also, I think this is something that is very important to the Midwest states. We are supporting the increase in an $8 billion tax credit in the 48C manufacturing. This would increase domestic manufacturing of clean energy technologies, including grid technologies. And this is we started off looking at our grid packages 25 billion. We're now at 50 billion, and this is a result of some of the input we've gotten from the Hill, including Senator Stabenow and Senator Manchin, who are writing the bill for 48C. I'll just quickly blow through the rest. Utility communications. This is critical. This is the thing I mentioned in terms of utilities being able to leverage their internal communication systems to provide broadband for their customers. It is critical to have a modern utility communication network as the backbone of a smart grid, but we want to make sure that people recognize that there is this other community benefit that could come from these investments. And then resilience, this is a very large piece of our recommendation across the state energy programs, the Department of Defense, the Federal Energy Management Program, public housing, and other places to really build resilience and address critical infrastructure. And then finally, I mentioned workforce development. Next slide, please. So we're going to continue to advocate for expanding the transmission and distribution discussion in an infrastructure package. And I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so much, Karen. I really appreciate it. Next, we will move on to.
Yeah, there's some background slides in here. You might want to just blow through to get to the next. There we go.
Thank you so much, Karen. We really appreciate it. We're going to answer our questions at the end of this session. So we're going to go ahead and move on to Mr. Jeffrey Shub. Please go right ahead.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for inviting me to join. Really happy to be a part of this discussion and share what I can about insights of what's coming out of the White House and happening in Congress around the American Jobs Plan and the broader proposals around building out clean energy infrastructure across the country. My name is Jeffrey Shub. I'm the executive director of the Coalition for Green Capital. We're a 501c3 nonprofit that's been working for over a decade now at the federal, state, local, and now internationally on the topic of clean energy finance, specifically partnering with governments, market participants, and other stakeholders to help design and stand up green banks that use public funds to mobilize far greater private investment into clean energy solutions across a whole range of sectors. There's now over 20 green banks across the country. Collectively over the last decade, they've mobilized over $7 billion of investment with about a 3-to-1 private to public leverage ratio. So of that $7 billion, about 3/4 of that is a private co-investment that comes along with the green bank dollars. A lot of focus on distributed generation, building efficiency upgrades in both residential and commercial space, as well as new movement into the transportation sector. There's also about 22 states across the country that are at some stage of exploration or development of a green bank. I think the latest of which is in Alaska. The Republican governor, Mike Dunleavy, introduced legislation to create a state green bank just 2 weeks ago. And so I'm not going to talk entirely about green banks, but just giving some context about our organization and our work around the country, as well as a current focus on federal green bank policy that I will talk about in a moment. Next slide, please. So I'm going to try to cover a range of subject matter, some of which Karen touched on, so I'm not going to go into more detail than she did. Clean energy finance, tax credits, buildings, and environmental justice. It's a sweeping set of topics. If you've actually read the 25-page fact sheet that the White House put out on its proposed American Jobs Plan, you will know there is a lot in there, and it's some of it is extremely specific, some of it is pretty open-ended. Some of it has legislation that's been written up for each component. Most of it does not. And so there is, I wouldn't say there's uncertainty, but the pathway forward for exactly how this policy gets turned into legislation and either passed or not passed by Congress is still a little bit up in the air. Generally speaking, from partners we're working with on Capitol Hill, it seems like the goal on the House side is to try to write up and pass infrastructure legislation by about 4th of July. I think some really hopeful folks think that that can be passed through the Senate by the end of July before the Senate goes into recess in August. It's just as likely it is not done by then and slips into September and possibly even October. From a political standpoint, I think the view is if it's not done by then, it's not going to happen, just because history shows that the window of when these sorts of things can be passed at the beginning of a presidential term is fairly tight. And once you get into the year of midterm elections, it's very, very hard to pass this kind of legislation. I believe the Affordable Care Act was passed in either January or February of 2010, which is probably as late as you can go for this sort of policy. And so that is why both the White House and folks in Congress are working as quickly as they can to figure out how to turn this massive and comprehensive plan into legislation that can be passed. And I'm sure we'll talk more in the discussion about what it actually means to pass this from a political perspective. But let me dive in onto the specific bullet points here. So on the topic of clean energy finance, and by that, I'm really zeroing in on proposals that talk about loans and financing mechanisms, not funding, meaning straight up paying for something. There's over $2 trillion of just expenditure, but I'm zeroing in on specifically on financing. So when it comes to clean energy infrastructure, there's two pieces that jump out in this plan around clean energy finance. One is the express proposal of what's called the Clean Energy and Sustainability Accelerator, which is a national green bank proposal that our organization has been working on. I'll come back to that and give a little bit more detail on that, because that's one that I happen to know a fair bit about. Karen also mentioned the newly proposed Grid Deployment Authority that would have innovative financing tools to finance transmission lines. I think there's a fair amount of uncertainty about what this actually means and what it looks like. I think it's meant to build on and expand the kinds of financial tools and authorities that entities like the Western Power Administration have already. In fact, it was just announced yesterday that about $3 billion is meant to be used by the Western Power Authority to finance new transmission lines. So I think that's an indication of the kinds of financing authority that could be created by this new entity, proposed entity that would in some way be within the Department of Energy. This is definitely something Karen knows more about, but I also gather that details are fairly sparse at this point. On the tax credit side, this is in some ways the biggest chunk of how the federal government is trying to engage in the finance sector. As Karen said, there's a proposed transmission-specific tax credit. I believe it's a 20% tax credit is the proposal that presumably would be structured similar to the investment tax credit. But then, as Karen also said, a significant portion of the proposal, about $400 billion worth of the extended and expanded investment tax credit, production tax credit, which are the sort of tried and true tax credit mechanisms that have been used for many, many years to support the deployment of clean energy solutions. These tax credits are in the process of being phased down right now. The proposal would extend them out for 10 years and then phase them down. But of equal importance, or perhaps more importantly, these would be, per the White House proposal, these would be converted to direct pay investment tax credit. So this is just another way of saying the government's just going to cut a check for cash to pay for that project subsidy, rather than have it be a tax credit that you can only absorb if you have a tax liability, which has really, really significant implications for how clean energy projects are financed and the role of the tax equity markets. In essence, these projects today require very large clean energy projects today require third-party equity investment from a small set of investors who reliably have the tax appetite, meaning they pay taxes at a large scale. And so they, in essence, want to buy the federal tax credit through their investment in clean energy to offset those tax liabilities. If this converts into direct pay and it's no longer actually dependent on there being a tax credit mechanism, it means anybody can use it. You don't have to have a large tax liability. Anybody can take and can use cash. So this would have a really radical transformation on how these markets actually function and how these projects are financed. And we saw a little bit of what this looked like back in the ARA days when for a period back in 2009, 2010, the exact same policy effectively was put in place called the 1603 cash grant program, where there was a surge in deployment because these projects could just access direct cash grants from the government rather than relying on tax equity markets. There's also a proposed expansion of the 45Q tax credit that's meant to support solutions like carbon capture, direct air capture, and retrofitting existing power plants to remove carbon emissions from the air. This is a tax credit there's a lot of political attention on, and it's seen as a way of trying to spark further deployment of those solutions, which for the most part are really not quite at scale or at commercial viability in most parts of the country. In the building space, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment, huge slug of money, over $200 billion going to buildings and affordable housing. This is a significant piece of not just a climate and emissions agenda, but also an environmental justice agenda focused on low-income communities and low-income households. And then lastly, in environmental justice, the policy broadly from the White House is that the infrastructure investment should ensure that 40% of the benefits of the investments go to disadvantaged communities. Big old question about what that actually means and how you measure it. There are people working on it, but we'll come back to that as well. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of background specifically on the Clean Energy Accelerator and the National Green Bank. So this is a campaign that our organization has been running for over 2 years now. These are the highlights. Effectively, this is a proposal to create a national green bank in the form of an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit corporation that would be capitalized with a direct grant from government at the proposed level of $100 billion. That is per the legislation introduced in the Senate by Senators Markey and Van Hollen, and in the House in a bill introduced by Representative Debbie Dingell from Michigan. Last year's version of the bill in the Senate was co-sponsored by now Vice President Harris. Last year's version of the bill also passed the House of Representatives 2 times. It was reintroduced this year, and in the House version, there is bipartisan co-sponsorship, including from Don Young of Alaska, the Dean of the House, who's not really known for signing on to massive progressive expenditures, to give you a sense of the bipartisan landscape across the country that supports green bank policies. A primary reason why does somebody like Don Young support this policy? It's because a primary function of the National Green Bank or the National Accelerator would be to provide capital to state and local green banks that are popping up around the country, but don't have the public funds to start making investments. And so, as I mentioned at the top, there's legislation to create a green bank in Alaska that would be primarily funded by the accelerator if it was formed. The policy has been endorsed by a large number of organizations and key groups, everything from National Academy of Sciences to more progressive groups like Data for Progress. It's included in the Clean Future Act, which is a very significant piece of House legislation that is effectively the House Energy and Commerce Committee's proposal for climate and clean energy legislation. So this policy is becoming somewhat ubiquitous, including an express endorsement of the policy in the American Jobs Plan. As one House staffer said to me last week, there are not a lot of proper nouns in the American Jobs Plan, meaning there's not like a lot of specific things that are being named and identified in there. It's a lot of ideas and policy concepts. But the Clean Energy and Sustainability Accelerator is one of those rare proper nouns where like, this is exactly a thing that we know what it is. We know what the legislation is. This is what we want to do. So we were really thrilled to see that in there. As you can see at the bottom, the group of supporters who have signed a letter of support that was issued a couple of weeks ago is really wide ranging, everything from Environmental Defense Fund to Amoresco to Keystone Energy Efficiency Alliance to Block Power and Generate Capital. As I said, there's several utilities on there, so it's got a really broad base of support. Next slide, please. Just to give you a sense of what it would do. So it has a wide authority to invest across a wide range of sectors. Basically, any sector that has an emissions profile in the country would be within the remit of what the accelerator and state green banks could invest in alongside private sector partners. Everything renewable power to grid infrastructure to transportation, either vehicles or infrastructure, to industrial decarbonization, and even natural solutions like reforestation and regenerative agriculture. Next slide, please. And then importantly, in sync with the president's overall environmental justice target, there's an explicit requirement within the bill that 40% of the investment of the accelerator go to disadvantaged communities, which is, I think, one of the reasons the White House supported this is, and I'll come back to this in a second, is figuring out how to make the existing federal government and spending apparatus direct 40% of the investment or 40% of the benefits of the investment into specific communities is actually extremely hard. Making programs within the federal government that were not designed to do that, start doing that kind of targeting is very legally complex. And the accelerator as an independent nonprofit has a level of flexibility to do this kind of targeting that is pretty hard otherwise within the federal government. Next slide, please. This is just a map of the landscape of where state green banks are. So the dark green is existing green banks, lighter green is where actions are being taken to create or explore green banks, and blue is where our organization is working with partners. So as you can see in the Midwest, there's been a good flurry of activity. This map has changed dramatically over the last 2 years as a number of states have moved forward, specifically in response to seeing the federal policy coming. A proposed nonprofit green bank has been introduced in legislation in Illinois as part of the Clean Energy Jobs Act, with a large coalition behind it. Legislation to study and evaluate a green bank has been proposed in Wisconsin, and legislation to create a state green bank has been introduced in Minnesota, so pieces are moving there. And then in Missouri, we were fortunate enough to work with the Missouri Energy Office several years ago on a green bank evaluation that was actually funded by the U.S. Department of Energy that we did in partnership with NASEO, the National Association of State Energy Officials. And we've just even had more recent conversations just in the last couple of weeks about burgeoning interest in this topic again in Missouri. And so as you can see, this map is no longer sort of concentrated in the politically blue parts of the country, but is spreading. As you know, as we're keen to point out, like if Alaska is moving forward on this, this means that this is an idea that really should be seen as nonpartisan. Next slide, please. And then the last sector I want to touch on in detail is the building space. As I said, this is, in some ways this is about infrastructure, and in some ways this is definitely about energy and climate. I think about 13% of emissions come from commercial and residential buildings in this country. But this is very much also about environmental justice and expanding sort of the social benefits of this investment into low-income sectors. So this includes funding for affordable housing and public housing, tax credits specifically for rehabbing low and moderate income households, as well as new competitive grant programs for local governments to change zoning and land use policies. And I think generally speaking, this list of policies, as well as the entire package, shows a pretty significant change in the approach to addressing climate change over the last decade, to one where the way that this president wants to address climate change is first and foremost by making people better off, making the kinds of investments that Americans across the country want and see that they need to improve their, whether it's their house or their electricity reliability or lower their energy bills. It's about proactive investment to improve the infrastructure to make people better off, which is why I think the policy is, from a polling perspective, been proven to be quite popular. Next slide, please. And last, just sort of teeing up a couple of questions that I'll sort of touch on and give some views on, as well as topics that maybe we can discuss later. On the financing side, we get asked this all the time, like what's the role of the DOE Loan Program Office in this policy, not just in relation to the accelerator, but just broadly, what's the expectation there? The Loan Program Office has about $40 billion of remaining loan authority, which doesn't mean it's literally sitting on a cash pile of $40 billion, but it can make up to $40 billion of loans and loan guarantees. That's siloed into different segments and different types of investments. So for example, it's about $4.5 billion or so, I believe, can be used for clean energy. Jigar Shah, an industry veteran and leader and well-respected sort of innovator in clean energy finance, is now in charge of that office. So everybody, myself included, is really excited to see what happens there. There's clearly a recognition that things need to be changed and reformed there. Yes, the DOE loan program office did not close a single loan during the Trump administration, but it also didn't close a clean energy loan overall since 2011. So this sort of indicates there are structural issues to be addressed. As they just announced yesterday, their intention is to reserve about $5 billion of that $40 billion loan authority specifically for transmission. I know folks that are working really hard to accelerate and move the pipeline of projects forward. I think it remains to be seen what sort of structural reforms can be made and whether they require statutory changes, or maybe there's flexibility within the existing statute to move beyond what's been done historically. I think on the tax credit side, a huge question is, will there be an overall reform for the tax credits to make them technology neutral? I know bills have been proposed just, I think, in the last week or so around this to simplify the tax credit structure around clean energy solutions so that it's not sort of piecemeal for individual technologies. This could certainly simplify things, but I don't know that, I think whether there's the political appetite to do that remains to be seen. And that's also not an area that I specialize in, so I'm not going to offer opinions. On the building side, this comes up a lot in our conversations around electrification. How is this money actually going to be deployed? And does the economic capacity exist to deploy it? $200 billion, that's a lot of project development. That's a lot of construction. That's good. Obviously, that means there's a job creation opportunity, but figuring out the pathways to that money is going to flow and how it actually gets into building upgrades remains to be seen. And there's definitely strategic thinking to be done across the entire proposal to ensure that the money can be spent quickly and wisely. And lastly, on environmental justice, this is something that the White House is leaning heavily into. They've established a new White House Environmental Justice Interagency Council. There is separately a White House Interagency Working Group on Coal and Power Plant Community and Economic Revitalization. Whether you call one of these topics environmental justice and the other one just transition, which is more focused on sort of the communities that might be economically harmed by this transition, they are definitely not one and the same, but I think they speak to a broader issue about what the United Mine Workers Association calls a true transition. How do we actually ensure that these benefits and the dollars themselves go to communities that need them most, whether it's because they are the communities that have been left behind already in the clean energy transition, or the communities that have suffered the most environmental harm because they are fence line communities right next to coal power plants and experience the most impact from emissions, or it's communities in Wyoming and West Virginia that are being, rotted out from the inside, economically speaking, because the markets for coal are evaporating and there's no other job opportunities. And it's not a trivial concern. I think the Biden administration shows that they are aware of this and are concerned with it. And the mine workers statement from just earlier this week, or maybe it was last week, basically said, we support the American Jobs Plan, but it has to include specific funding and policies targeting our workers so that we're not left behind, which I think shows that there is a pathway for compromise and certainly a very high level of awareness on the environmental justice side for low-income communities. So I'll stop there and really look forward to a broader conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Next, we will move on to Ian Adams. Welcome and thank you for talking.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. I'm happy to be here this morning and joined by a couple friends on the panel. So great to be here. My name is Ian Adams. I work at Clean Energy Trust. What we do is we support and invest in early stage businesses in the energy and clean tech space, specifically in the Midwest. So we've made investments in Kansas City and in St. Louis. So we're talking the really early stage businesses typically before venture capital has been invested. And we invest in this space to help those companies along so that they can get to a place where they can seek more traditional financing and scale up. Most of these are companies developing, hardware solutions in the clean energy and clean technology space, and it can be difficult to get going as a business. So we are providing support to those early stage businesses. And in that context, we think a lot about the future, like the businesses that we're working with are scaling, but they may be really hitting their prime in 5 or 10 years. And so what the economic landscape, what the policy landscape looks like in the future really matters to those businesses. And so that's sort of the lens with which we come here. Feel free to hop over to the next slide, please. So quickly, I'm just going to be talking a bit about clean electricity standards, clean energy standards that were referenced earlier, as well as just mention some of the other things happening, climate goals, and sort of energy transition trends, try to pull a couple things together. I may speed through a little bit of that second part to make sure we have plenty of time for discussion, because I think we've got great people on the panel and want to make sure we get to hear from everyone. So let's hop to the next slide. Actually, one more after that. So clean energy standard or a clean electricity standard, what is this? I think Jeff mentioned like this infrastructure plan has a lot of ideas and concepts, not a lot of proper nouns, I think is the way he put it. I like that. This is one of them. This is an idea or concept one where essentially the goal is to move to 100% carbon emissions free power by 2035. That's pretty straightforward. When you actually look at the fact sheet, there's not a whole lot more to it than that. I included the quote there, but essentially we're going to put a clean electricity standard in place. So how do we go about doing this? What does this look like? I can talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. Now, essentially, there are a bunch of different ways that you could do this. And for reasons I'll talk about in a little bit, these are all ideas that have been proposed in a way that could be consistent with reconciliation, that relate to revenue. But essentially, I think I'll talk through these quickly, but the high level is that there are a variety of approaches here. You could go a lot of different ways and either get exactly at or close to what you're looking for. You could do credits for increasing the amount of clean energy that's delivered that sit on the sort of the federal balance sheet. You could issue a reverse auction, which is really a two-sided auction for clean energy production credits. That's really similar to a system that New York has put in place for their 100% clean energy standard. You could also issue credits for pollution reduction. That's, if you remember back in the Clean Power Plan days, that's sort of like a mass-based approach. How much is this state or area polluting in general for generating power emissions? That's very similar to the 100% carbon-free emissions plan that Arizona has put in place. And then there's a lot of other things you could do that maybe aren't exactly to the letter of the law of this is exactly a clean electricity standard, but sort of get at the goal. Because at the end of the day, it's really the goal they're shooting for to decarbonize that power sector. So one is conditional block grants, which is sort of like, if you remember, a race to the top for the education system back about a decade ago, similar. So you could put in block grants, so funding to states for making incremental progress on their own carbon-free standards or clean electricity standards. So, for example, they get a bunch of funding for setting an interim goal. Maybe that's 40% by 2025 or what have you. I'm making the specific number up. You could also do a carbon intensity standard. Back, for those of you wearing your Clean Power Plan hats back in the day, this would be like a rate-based approach that you could do with a fee and a rebate. And then, another approach, which doesn't exactly get at the top line number, but you could do comprehensive tax credits, with or without a fee on pollution. And that goes to, some of the tax credits that Karen and Jeff were talking about, doing a lot of different tax credits for the things that you would be doing anyway under a clean electricity standard. So it's really, different ways you can pour the water in the top and have it run out the bottom. But at the end of the day, these are all approaches to decarbonizing the power sector, and all could potentially be compliant with reconciliation if that was the direction they went. I put a couple blue stars on a couple of these because I wanted to call them out. That conditional block grant idea, that's something that the Energy Secretary, Jennifer Granholm, has mentioned publicly a couple times. And I also star comprehensive tax credits because that's been an area, or at least some tax credits, wind and solar tax credits has been an area that Republicans and Democrats have been able to agree on. That those, the block grants or tax credits, those are things that don't include mandates. Truth be told, the most efficient and cost-effective and streamlined mechanism probably would include that mandate, but they're very unpopular with some folks. So conditional block grants and comprehensive tax credits are things that theoretically a lot of people could get behind because you're not forcing anyone's hand. You're sort of giving people options to invest in things. Let's go to the next slide. A few considerations that I've already mentioned is reconciliation. If the Democrats want to just move this through with Democratic votes, then it would need to be reconciliation compliant. There are lots of reasons why people disagree about what exactly fits in there, but essentially it needs to be related to taxing and spending. So there are different ways that you could craft that. Some would be a little bit more efficient than others, but probably a number of different ways that you could strike at that issue. Another thing to think about that I sort of was just referring to is, standards versus fees and taxes. They could both get you the same place, but more recently we have found that clean energy standards, where a state says we are going to meet 100% or a certain percent of carbon-free emissions power by a date and figure out the mechanics for it, tend to be easier to generate a positive will around and pass than a tax or a fee on an activity. And this sort of makes sense, when we're talking about new ideas for the government or anywhere, we're talking about, like, what are we actually trying to achieve first? When you talk about expanding a safety or a social safety net program or creating some tax cuts, regardless of party, people don't lead with, well, it's going to increase the debt, or we're going to have to pay for it. They lead with what you're getting out of it, which is the goal, 100% emissions-free power. Other considerations that my guess may actually be a little secondary are complexity and cost and oversight. What's the implementing entity? It could be FERC, it could be the Department of Energy, it could be EPA, there could be pieces other places. If it's tax credits, the Treasury Department's involved. How complex or simple is this, and how streamlined is it? Jeff was talking about how direct pay would really streamline financing. There's definitely considerations for how complicated you want to make the system versus just sending that signal, and then what's going to be the most efficient or costly. Another thing to think about, and it comes back to reconciliation too, is if you go the reconciliation route, everything has to have like a 10-year window. Which is why, if you remember the tax cuts that were passed under the Bush administration, they expired and then were renegotiated, and some of them were kept a few years back in 2012 or 2013 because of that 10-year window. So, truth be told, it would be difficult to, through reconciliation, say we're definitely going to do 100% carbon emissions-free power by 2035, but it could be 80% by 2030, which is a date a lot of people are talking about, and it sort of creates the infrastructure and pathway to get to 100% by 2035. That 80% by 2030 is also interesting because, a lot of people agree that first 70 or 80%, we know how to do that pretty cost effectively. There was a study that Energy Innovation did recently that actually said you can actually do it for no cost, essentially. It would be cheaper if you just went to 80% renewables by 2030 because of the extreme declines in cost in wind and solar. That last 20% is harder, legitimately harder, and we will need some new solutions or approaches. And so it's also politically easier to get to that 80% and allows you to defer some of the hardest issues as you're still developing and lowering costs on some of these technologies. The most important consideration, though, I think, is politics. At the end of the day, it needs to be something that can be passed. If it goes through reconciliation, the pivotal person is Joe Manchin of West Virginia. He has said a lot of things about what he would or would not be willing to support. He said that he wants it to be bipartisan infrastructure. He said he doesn't want to do clean energy policy through reconciliation. He hasn't specifically said that he has ruled out anything that relates to tax credits or supporting clean energy investment, but that's really going to be a driving concern. Let's go to the next slide. And I'll hop through these things quickly because I know we're a little short on time. Let's hop to the next slide. just since it was in the news recently, just wanted to put a little bit on paper about US climate goals. Biden announced a goal of reducing economy-wide emissions by 50% by 2030, and that's versus 2005. So there's a nice graphic there from the New York Times that sort of says what were we doing over time. Turns out we've been decreasing emissions since 2005, which is largely a mix of natural gas replacing coal and more renewables coming online. And then the pledge would get more aggressive, but sort of continue that downward trend. Another thing that I thought was interesting, a recent study, in the lower right, it's probably too small to see the specifics of, but a group from Lawrence Berkeley Lab went back and looked at what did the EIA think was going to happen in the United States over the last 15 or so years, and compared to where our government thought emissions were going to be in the power sector, we're actually down about 50%. Now, some of that is COVID in 2020. It's maybe 45 or 42% if you look at 2019. And they did expect emissions to rise, but it's an interesting data point because it goes to the point of, can we achieve these goals? How aggressive are they? We don't always know exactly how quickly things are moving. And I think that's really relevant as we think about setting targets for the future. It's the future is not always going to be exactly what we expect. Let's hop to the next slide. Just sort of tying a bow around it, if you're going to take a comprehensive approach, I think there are a lot of different pieces. We've talked about a lot of them already, but that you would be going to, whether or not you're going through a clean electricity standard or just pulling a bunch of different levers, trying to decarbonize the power sector and our economy in general. And it really comes down to, our system, our infrastructure. Is our system ready? Karen was saying, is the grid ready? Expanding transmission so renewables can come in. Expanding electric vehicle infrastructure as we move that direction with the electrification of transit, financing these mechanisms, putting some sort of push or standard in place to ensure that there are clear signals being set, and then making investments in R&D, especially for some hardest to decarbonize stuff like steel and cement, that sort of thing. Let's hop over one more slide. The last thing I would say before I wrap up is that, obviously it is hard to do a lot on a bipartisan basis in Washington, but that I really do think that things are different in interesting ways now. When we talk about interesting stakeholders, I think Jeff mentioned the United Mine Workers of America. They've sort of put out what they think matters, but they have sort of signaled that they would be open to comprehensive policy, which by and large would transition the nation away from using coal power for the most part, if investments are made to support those communities, if there's investments in carbon capture so you could continue to run some of these plants if you wanted to. And so I think that's really striking that the mine workers are coming out saying like, hey, we're not necessarily against this. Similarly, it's hard to read all these logos, but there are two groups here, the Corporate Electric Vehicle Alliance and the Business for Innovative Climate and Energy Policy, or BICEP, that are both pushing for 100% zero emission vehicle standards by 2035. That might seem interesting to folks because it's about, right now, 2-3% of our vehicles, passenger vehicles in the United States are electrified. It's going to change a lot, but you have folks, here, it's not just folks who have a stake in the electricity and energy production industry here. You got McDonald's and Starbucks and Unilever and IKEA. These are not companies that you would necessarily expect to be way out on the edge in terms of policy, which may suggest that they don't think that this is a particularly aggressive policy. It doesn't mean that McDonald's is putting all of their lobbying muscle behind this policy, but I think it is a really interesting point when you look at stakeholders. Corporations are in a place where they understand the challenges of the climate and their accountability to shareholders, and they are starting to move in that direction. And so they are interested in the government moving as well to make it easier for them to achieve that. Other final points, anything that's creating jobs is obviously better than something that does not. That's probably pretty obvious to folks. And I just want to mention carbon capture and regulation. I think there's a big opportunity there, partially because Joe Manchin is likely the deciding vote. there are lots of opportunities for folks interested in carbon capture because of the tax credits or subsidies that are likely to come into play because of his role in crafting policy. And the final one is you could do other things. It doesn't just have to be a clean electricity standard on its own. That's the direction the administration is going right now. But of course, there are a variety of regulatory levers you could use to move in the direction of that goal. One more slide for me. And just to wrap up, I would say there, summary thoughts here. There's a lot of approaches and tools to implementing a clean electricity standard and just meeting the goal that they're looking for. In general, it's easier to catch flies with honey than vinegar. So money and tax credits tend to be a lot more popular than mandates and standards, although the standards may be more effective in actually getting you to the goal. The politics of this may drive things more than the specific policies of what exactly is the platonic ideal policy, right? It's about getting the votes. And these climate goals and intentions are large, but I think with policy, they are feasible. That's all I have, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Ian. So I'm going to just read the first question, and we'll just go down the line. Whichever of the panelists would like to answer, or if all three would, please go right ahead. So the first question is, what is known or can be inferred about grid scale power storage?
That's a great question, and I think we're in the decade of storage. We have seen dramatic declines in the cost of all clean energy technologies, but over the last decades, it's been really striking in terms of the declines in lithium-ion batteries, which has been an 88% decline in the last decade. In fact, I saw that question, so I just pulled up a few stats. The industry has grown 264% in the last decade. And in 2020, in the third quarter of 2020, 476 megawatts were installed. That's grid scale storage. And that was a 240% increase over what was installed in the second quarter of 2020. And I split my time between DC and Vegas, and our utility in Nevada was looking at putting out RFPs for solar projects. And a couple years ago, they got solar project costs that were in the $34 to $36 a megawatt hour. The next year, the price of solar plus storage, not solar standalone, was in the 20s. And so just over the course of a year, the price has declined. We're seeing it paired with storage so that it's providing ramping services. We're seeing it deployed on transmission systems to address transmission constraints. We're seeing it in the distribution system to provide ancillary services, voltage, frequency regulation. And of course, we're seeing it behind the meter as well. So it is, if we're going to keep seeing an increase in deployment, but if there's any kind of bend in the curve in the rate, it would be because of capacity and supply chain issues. So it's real. Now, this gets me back to my comment about the need to make investments in the grid itself. For us to truly take advantage of the services that storage can provide to the grid, we need better software, we need better controls and sensors. So I keep hearing the focus on building new transmission as a way to harness the power of renewables, but we also need to invest in the grid itself, because we've got to manage how that power flows over the grid, and that's going to be grid enhancing technologies. Storage is one, but then as we install more storage, we need all those controls and sensors as well to actually, use the power of that storage can provide.
And just to add, Karen's got the details down pat, and I think just a broader step back view, what is the actual strategy of what Biden's plan means? What is he actually saying is the decarbonization pathway for this plan? In a really, really simplified way, he is saying step one is decarbonize the grid. Step two is to try to eliminate emissions from transportation. And let's start there. And, the pathway, this is sort of understood now, the pathway to decarbonization in the US comes through electrifying everything, but we have to make sure that electricity is clean. And so hence the expansion of tax credits for renewable generation, hence the new investments in transmission in the grid to carry that power and, as you said, smartly use the grid as it exists. But it's also why there's a massive amount of investment in not just vehicle incentives in charging stations, but also in upstream manufacturing and supply chain, particularly for electric vehicles. And so, and also, sorry, then in many ways, the linchpin to making that all work is the clean energy standard that Ian talked about. It's sort of you put the pieces together and you have a clean energy standard and investment to make sure the power is clean and that the new power that's built is clean too. And then you have that put into an energy system in the United States that is more reliant on electricity, starting with the transportation space. All of that only works if you have a huge amount of storage on the grid connected to a smart and well-constructed grid. And as Ian said, the study that he referred to from Energy Innovations identified that, on the power side, it's not really more complicated than build a giant amount of solar, a giant amount of wind, and a giant amount of storage and connect that to a really well-constructed grid. And that is basically the strategy that the Biden administration seems to be leaning into.
Thank you. So the next question is regarding funding for affordable housing and public housing. Are there energy standards mentioned in this plan or third-party certification? Curious because presently Missouri Housing Development Commission has energy standards established for new construction, but none for renovation projects.
Interesting question. I don't believe there are energy standards expressly identified or sort of hinted at in the Biden plan. And my read on the building section here, and this is what most of the conversation was about among sort of advocates, is the building investment is energy is a part of it, but it's really meant to be a comprehensive approach to improving the comfort, safety, health, and efficiency of housing writ large, which means, yes, it means efficiency, but it also means mold remediation. It means removing lead pipes. It means resilience and strengthening roofs. And yes, it does mean things like solar on the roof, but it's really meant to be a broader approach to investing in the upgrading of housing across the country to make people's lives better and make people's homes more comfortable and safe and healthy. So it's not super surprising to me that the plan didn't include an energy specific sort of efficiency standard, which isn't to say that it won't ultimately be put in there through a legislative process. But my read on the building and housing piece of this is that it's just as much about sort of comprehensive, socially oriented investments to improve people's lives in their homes as much as it is about sort of extracting every bit of efficiency.
Thank you. I think this next question refers to one of your last slides, Ian. Why do some of the companies care? Does it just make them look good and being included in slides like this? I think it refers to the companies who had pledged to EV.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think it's it does, there could be a marketing side of it. I think largely a lot of companies have realized that they need to go this direction. And so leaders, and many of them want to, they want to decarbonize. They don't want to, and no one wants to destroy the world, and so they've already set goals or they care deeply about sustainability. And, I would use an analogy that they want to do this and their shareholders are pushing them. And so they recognize that it's good business, but that doesn't mean it's always going to be easy. It's sort of like if you want to do the right thing, if your friend asks you to move, you may not really want to help, but maybe you'll help them out. But if your friend asks you to, selectively breed cattle or something, that's not something I know anything about. That's going to be harder for me to do. I could try, and I'll do my best. But for a lot of these, if they're already moving in this direction, it would make their lives a lot easier if the government just says, yeah, everybody should do this because they're already moving, they've already committed to it. And if the government providing a clear signal is going to encourage investment, it's going to help drive down prices even more quickly. And, so it makes it easier. The last thing is that I think is an interesting spot where 2035, 100% vehicle standard is sounds aggressive. In reality, I think, by 2030, at least 3/4 of vehicles are going to be electrified, passenger vehicles, I would expect. I might be wrong. But so in reality, it may be one of these things where by the time we get there, it's like, oh yeah, why would we do something different? Maybe totally uncontroversial by the time we get there, but it looks great now because it's like a visionary thing.
If I could jump in, our members are all, the majority of our members are for-profit companies. And in the utility sector, these are companies that make investments, that range from 20 to 50 years. So they have long embraced decarbonization as the future of their industry, both because beneficial electrification actually increases their sales, and this is an industry that's been affected by declining load growth over the years because of the success of energy efficiency, but also because they have to make smart investments, and they recognize that there were going to be state policies for decarbonization, aggressive state policies that they would have to respond to. So they actually have, they're going to be supportive of a clean energy standard because it provides that sort of national policy certainty for these long-term investments that they have to make. I will say, though, that we have this difficulty in federal goals and state level approval for these processes. That the utilities would like to make these investments, but they have to put together long-term plans. They have to bring them to a state utility commission. They have to be very careful about the rate impacts on consumers. And federal funding for these investments would actually help accelerate them and help the Public Utility Commission speed up the investments. So I can't emphasize enough the importance. Ian, you're talking about seeing 30, 40, 50% of electric vehicles sold in coming years. It takes a long time to get a rate case through a state Public Utility Commission to make the investments that need to be made in order to provide the reliability and strength of the grid at the local level. I've talked to a utility that said, in some places, if we have more than 2 electric vehicles in a little neighborhood, we might run into some reliability without some issues and investment. And there are going to be places, for example, let's take an Amazon warehouse. It's at the way end of a feeder. They may not be able to electrify their fleet and plug it in the place where their warehouse is. They may have to work with the utility to find another place on the grid that is ready for a big fleet charging infrastructure. And this is when I think about the federal fleet like flipping over so quickly as the White House is envisioning. Have they talked to the utilities that that are servicing where they think those fleets are going to be plugged in? Because we may have to make really quick investments in the grid in order to accommodate these big changes in transportation electrification. So when I hear new transmission is going to solve our problems, it is not just new transmission. It's got to be investments in the grid as well. My soapbox.
Thank you, Karen and Ian. So we only have 1 minute left, but we do have 3 questions. So I don't know if maybe we want to do a follow-up with the questions, but I want to be conscious of everyone's time, especially our great panelists. So I will leave that maybe to Josh and Travis to reconcile that. But I really appreciate all the panelists today. Wonderful talk, and I will pass this off to Josh and Travis to move on to the next.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
That was fantastic. Thank you all very much. There was a lot of information there. So thank you. Very, very valuable. And yes, the presentations will be available, and we'll address these questions and other things as we go forward.